You're listening to an IEA podcast. Today you'll hear from Dr. Steve Davies and Kate Andrews as they discuss growing trends for economic nationalism. From the leftward shift of the Conservative Party in Britain to the rise of Donald Trump in America, there seems to be a growing appetite for protectionism and central planning in contemporary politics. Steve and Kate examine some of the reasons behind this trend and whether advocates of free trade are losing the battle of ideas in the 21st century. They also look at what protectionist governments hope to achieve from adopting these policies and how likely they will be to succeed in bringing back jobs for declining domestic industries. If you like what you hear, visit our website, iea.org.uk, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, username IEA London.
Steve, if we look at what's going on in the world today, what's most striking about the state of our intellectual or political debate?
Well, I'm afraid the answer I'll give to that question is that it's rather gloomy. Because if you're an economist, certainly, or somebody of a classical liberal libertarian persuasion, then what is most striking about political and intellectual debate today is the sudden resurgence of bad ideas. There are a whole number of ideas out there which I think most people on the free market side thought had been slain, stuck in the ground, and had a stake driven through their heart. But suddenly all of these vampire or zombie ideas are reviving again and making great progress, I'm sad to say. So the most striking feature is indeed the fact that ideas that we thought had been defeated 20 years ago, or even longer ago in some cases, are now starting to make a big comeback in terms of both intellectual support, but more importantly, political support.
I assume you're referring to things like free trade, just the basics of economics. Don't spend more than you have.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there are a number of ideas like this. Radical egalitarian ideas are one example, but the most pressing, and I think potentially the most dangerous one, is the revival of protectionism and economic nationalism as both intellectual and, more importantly, political forces. For a very long time, actually, pretty much ever since the end of World War II, in fact, the opinion of both the intellectual elites, economists and others, and increasingly of the political class in most developed countries has been that free trade is the way to go and that economic nationalism is a thoroughly bad idea. So protectionism has had always a certain number of populist politicians who support it, but it's not been a policy that's commanded really widespread support in the political class, and despite some popular support, it's never really had much of an impact on the political debate. All that is now changing. We're now seeing, with the election of Donald Trump in the United States, with the rise of parties of the populist right in Europe, a sudden upsurge in interest in economic nationalism. Here in the United Kingdom, Theresa May has launched an industrial strategy, we're told. We get a sudden revival of the whole idea of a national industrial strategy as one of the main things we should be doing in the aftermath of Brexit. And this is all part of a very alarming trend. It's also happening intellectually with the growing popularity of people like Ha-Joon Chang, the Korean economist up at Cambridge, with his advocacy of infant industry protectionism and the revival of the old 19th century ideas of Friedrich List of national economy as opposed to international economy. And so this is very, very alarming for all sorts of reasons.
What is this new drive and where has it come from that people are so desperate to protect national industry?
Well, there's a number of interesting things you can say about that. The first and most obvious thing to say is that from the economist point of view, these ideas of economic nationalism, protectionism, support for domestic industry, a national industrial strategy are seriously wrong-headed if your main concern is with economic welfare, general economic well-being and the like. Because a policy of this kind is essentially going to impoverish the great majority of the population to flow funds to protected special interest groups. In addition, ultimately, it's going to be futile, most economists believe, because you're not going to be able to successfully protect industries of the kind that the advocates of these policies want to protect in the kind of world that we now have. And to the extent that you are able to protect them, what you're going to do is to raise costs, reduce people's living standards, basically make everybody worse off than they would otherwise be. So, despite what some people say, there is absolutely no economic case for these policies. Now, what that then raises is the question of why there is so much support for them. Now, One answer could be that basically you can't keep a bad idea down. Another possibility might be that although the economists and the economically educated, you might say, are all opposed to protectionism and economic nationalism, that the majority of the public, or very large parts of the public at any rate, are economically illiterate and don't understand the economics and are prey to economic quacks of one kind or another. But I actually think that that's a bit unfair, and I think that in fact the main reason for support for economic nationalism and things of this sort comes from non-economic sources. It's not that people essentially think this is the right economic policy. There is some of that. But I think the real impetus behind the political revival of these ideas is different. And I think there's two sources. The first is a fear of change. A feeling that the world is changing too rapidly, a feeling that old, traditional, established ways of making a living, ways of running the economy have been destroyed and swept away, and this is regretted. It's very striking that most of the economic nationalists, like, for example, the people around Donald Trump in the United States, are not interested in protectionism or having an industrial strategy in order to build a new high-tech, glossy future. What they want to do, typically, is to use protectionism to revive the old industries. Steel, heavy manufacturing, car making, things of that sort.
Coal.
In other words, yes, coal, exactly. The whole idea is actually not to create a new economy, rather it's to somehow go back to the economy and the employment patterns of the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s. And so I think what drives that is a kind of deep nostalgia, a kind of conservatism and hankering after the way things were, the kind of work and the kind of jobs that there were 40 to 50 years ago. And that feeds into a whole number of anxieties. Anxieties about the nature of work, anxieties about masculinity and the apparent decline in what you might call manly jobs, a whole number of things like that which are all tangled up together. So I think that's the first reason why these ideas are reviving is, as I say, a fear of change and a desire to turn the clock back, or at least to stop it going forward anymore. And I think the second thing is that it's associated with a wish to reassert a traditional national identity. And this is a reaction against the growing tide of globalization and cosmopolitanism. Many people find this highly threatening and highly disturbing, and what they wish to reassert is a traditional vision of a rooted, very often ethnically defined community of one kind or another. And the increasing integration of economies worldwide, the increasing flow of trade, the increasing movement of people and capital that's associated with globalization is seen as a threat to that identity. And so there's a very strong feeling that in order to assert national identity, in order to protect this notion of a national community, you need to have a national economy which is, to some degree at any rate, separated from the rest of the world and under the control of the national political class and the national electorate, rather than to have greater degrees of economic integration with the rest of the world. And so there's a very close association between economic nationalism, the idea that the nation should be an economic entity, and the idea of ethnic or some other kind of national community.
It's hard to draw the difference sometimes, especially in specific moments, between national identity and ethnic identity. National identity surely is something that could be closely associated with patriotism, which nobody immediately frowns upon. This idea that no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, you can throw on a baseball cap and a t-shirt that says I love America on the 4th of July and party with everyone around you. However, it doesn't seem to be the case that that's actually how it pans out. It so often trickles into ethnic identity, which most of us feel much more upset and concerned about.
Well, this is absolutely true. This is the classic distinction that political scientists make between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. The idea of nationalism is that the basis for the political community is the nation. But that, of course, only then raises the question of, well, what is the nation and how do you define it? The 19th century British philosopher Henry Sidgwick had quite a lengthy discussion of this, and he went through a whole number of the ways in which you can define a national identity. And it could be through language, it could be through attachment to a territory, it could be through a shared history, it could be through ethnicity or racial identity, it could be through religious identity, or it could be through support for a particular set of political institutions and ideals associated with those institutions. Now, that last one is civic nationalism. So there is a kind of American nationalism, which you alluded to in your question, which sees American identity as being defined essentially by support for the institutions institutions of the American polity, particularly the Constitution, and to a set of political values associated with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and a number of other historic founding documents of the United States. That kind of nationalism clearly does not connect itself. The national consciousness is not associated with particular racial identity or ethnic identity or anything else. To be an American, all you have to do is to espouse or subscribe to that particular set of values and the particular political settlement that they're embodied in. This is the kind of nationalism the Scottish National Party articulates in Scotland, for example. They're very clear that they are not about ethnic identity. They're about Scottishness defined as being part of a particular kind of political community. And Nicola Sturgeon recently said, for example, that if she had had the choice, then they wouldn't be called the Scottish National Party, precisely because she's a bit wary of the other kind of associations the term has. However, the problem is this. Sidgwick, in the discussion I mentioned, said that ultimately what it comes down to is whether or not a group of people have a national consciousness. Do they see themselves as having some kind of shared identity with other people? And the problem is that while you may like or advocate civic nationalism, it appears that in many cases things like shared ethnic identity, shared religion, shared language are much more likely to create a national consciousness than is support for shared political ideals. It seems that simply those kind of ties or those kinds of similarities between people are much more likely to generate the national identity, the national consciousness. The problem, of course, is that whereas civic nationalism is open-doored in the sense that anybody can join the nation simply by affirming that they support the principles, this is not the case with ethnic identity. You can't change your ethnic identity in the same way that you can change your allegiance in that sense. And so an ethnic-based nationalism is almost inherently exclusionary and particularist. Now, for many people, that's not a problem. There is, of course, a whole political philosophy which says that this is fine. But on the other hand, many people find this deeply disturbing, as I do, for example, partly because divisions of this kind historically can often lead to serious conflict in the world over scarce resources or territory, and also because I think it leads to an introverted and inward-looking way of living and a way of asserting an identity which is prescribed and fixed rather than chosen. Which is something I disagree with.
Do you think that economic nationalism is always bound to lead to these more dangerous outcomes?
Almost certainly, yes. In theory, you can imagine having a civic nationalism which also follows the policy of economic nationalism as an industrial strategy, for example. The problem is that precisely because it's actually bad economics, such a strategy is almost inevitably going to impose severe costs on the public. And what that means is that essentially the public will eventually rebel against it and they will revert back to a more sound economic policy. However, if you wish to keep that going because you believe that in the absence of this, the nation state will not be sufficiently independent, will not have enough freedom of action because of its integration into world economy, then I think you're going to be driven to identifying the nation in some other sense so that you can then make the argument that, okay, even if we are worse off because we're pursuing the policy of economic nationalism, it's still better because it's bringing benefits to our people. And so I do think that there's a kind of intellectual symmetry or affinity between economic nationalism and the other more restrictive kinds of nationalism. And there's a natural kind of affinity, on the other hand, between a more free trade and open economic policy and the more civic kind of nationalism or patriotism.
Why on earth is almost every major political party in the UK flirting with some level of economic nationalism right now?
I think that's a very good question. And I think the reason is because there's a large block of voters out there who are strongly committed and wedded to a particular vision of British national identity, who are afraid of change and who are strongly supportive of some kind of more economically nationalist politics. We saw this with the arguments before and during the Brexit referendum last year over things like the British steel industry, with the closing down of the plants at Port Talbot and up near Middlesbrough at Redcar. And that group of voters, who you can sort of loosely describe as older, more culturally conservative, often working class voters in ex-industrial areas, but also in other parts of the country as well, they're very much up for grabs at the moment. And on the one hand, I think the Conservative Party sees this as a huge opportunity to make inroads into the Labour Party's historical heartlands. And on the other hand, the Labour Party, of course, is very concerned to hang on to those heartlands because it's where a lot of their safe seats are. And so because this group of voters is now being competed for by both of the major parties, their particular concerns and anxieties are tending to receive a lot of attention, or more attention than previously, in the arguments, the party programmes and the like. Of course, what this means is that both parties are ignoring the other large block of voters, the more, you might say, metropolitan, cosmopolitan, globally oriented and typically younger voters in places like London, the more successful metropolitan areas. Maybe they're now starting to kick back a bit. And I think the nature of our party system is that you can't ultimately have both parties appealing for that same block of voters. Sooner or later, one of the two parties is going to have to decide that they're going to not go down that route and the other one will. But I do think we're going to have a politics in which that kind of economic and cultural nationalism becomes a much more powerful and prominent argument, as we're seeing in the United States, I think, where I think the Republican Party, regardless of what happens to Donald Trump personally, is reverting back to its historic identity as the party of American nationalism. And part of that is going to be, I think, a reversion back to what again was the historic Republican position of protectionism and economic nationalism, which was what the party believed in right up to Herbert Hoover, basically. Now, interestingly, I think the Democrats will probably, almost certainly, in fact, I think eventually be driven back to their historic position as the party of free trade and internationalism. So we're going to see actually a kind of reversion back to the 19th century division between the two big parties in the United States.
Your points on fear of change and national identity as the two areas driving economic nationalism are very well taken. But is there also an issue that the argument for free trade and globalization hasn't been made well enough in recent years?
I think there is something in that. I think that basically economists and other advocates of free trade became a bit complacent.
Thought it was a done deal.
We thought it was a done deal, essentially. We thought this argument would be won. Nobody in their right mind is going to advocate protectionism these days. And even if they do advocate it, they're basically just, idiots who are not going to get any kind of purchase or popular success.
And they're not.
And that's absolutely, that has proved to be untrue. I think the lesson to take from this is that you should remember that the dragons of economic error are always reviving and needing to be slain. And the case does need to be made. And there are people like my friend Don Boudreau at George Mason University who are making the case tirelessly, but there needs to be more people like Don, really. We need to make this case again. And it needs to be made also not just on purely economic grounds. It's all very well making the case for free trade and globalization on the grounds that it's going to make people better off, and all this is true. But as I've said, the reason why people don't like it in many cases are not to do with the economics. So you also need to make the non-economic case for cosmopolitanism, globalism and free trade. The case that it's going to increase human diversity, it's going to increase the range of options open to people, that it's going to lead to greater flexibility, if you like, in the way people live. And also that it's more likely to lead to peace, and it's more likely to lead to a world which is varied and diverse, but at the same time with much less conflict than would be the case if we go down the very dangerous road of economic nationalism.
Make sure to check out more blogs, podcasts and films at our website, iea.org.uk.